Okay, I'm here with another Reflections interview, and it's another Dota 2 one. And my guest this time is LD, well-known commentator. How's it going?
Good, good. I'm enjoying my coffee. It's like 3 o'clock in the afternoon, so we're getting out of bed. We're getting ready to be productive today.
Okay, before we get into the Dota stuff, I mean, other people might get mad in certain communities if you talk about other games, okay? But first of all, I'll do that anyway, so that's not a problem for me, mate, if they get mad. But this is a Valve game anyway, okay? I know you initially, not just from casting Dota, etc., but I know you were a follower of Counter-Strike. And I know in the past, sometimes so every now and then when I would post like a really old school type article that went back into some player from like 10 years ago, those seems to be the ones where you always would like tweet that or something, or you were into that in some sense. So you were not just a player, but you followed the game as well, right?
Yeah, I played. I think I started playing competitive Counter-Strike when I was like 12 years old. So that was like 15 years ago at this point. And I was in high school. I formed a team with all my friends from school. Me and my mates were pretty terrible. There were 2 of us who were decent, who kind of continued playing competitively for a while. And I didn't really follow the competitive scene necessarily when I first started playing, but I think I came in at Retail 1.0. I had seen one of my old friends play it like in beta 5.2, and the Colt had the scope, and it's just a completely ridiculous weapon.
Better days, mate. Better days.
Yeah. Hey, it was fun to play with it, but it was kind of bullshit otherwise. So, I think that was also when the AWP had it had the pip in the middle of the screen, even when you weren't zoomed in. So. Yeah, it was fun times.
Are you for real right now? That was the best era, mate. And for someone who plays Dota, you should especially enjoy it because everything was overpowered as fuck. Like, you could shoot the deagle while you jump in. The AWP had the crosshair on it, so you could just aim without having the scope. The Colt had a little scope. It was awesome. Everything was great. You could jump around corners. That's Dota, right? Yeah,
you could strafe jump. They nerfed it a bit. Like, you still could in a CS original Counter-Strike, but it was not as easy. I sucked at strafe jumping. That was the one thing I could never master. But yeah, so I played competitively for like, I think 8 years on and off. And when I really got into it actually was when SK played X3 at the CPL event, and K Sharp had that absolutely bonkers map.
Yeah, 30 kills or something.
Yeah, that was my first big time watching a tournament. So I fiended. I would watch through HLTV, and a lot of people watch through Source TV and Dota TV, and the product's pretty polished now, but back then it was terrible. Servers would get full, and you'd have to like frantically try to find a new IP, and you'd randomly, if you disconnected, you couldn't get back in. It was a real free for all. But yeah, so I followed the game really closely. I got up to, I think Cal Premier was the highest I got, so I was a decent player. I went to some local lands. I obviously was never good enough to be a pro, but I just loved it. It was. I loved the game so much that like I would go into school, and I was always pretty good at getting my work done like before I went home, so I could maximize my gaming time. Eventually, my mom kind of tried to put the brakes on that anyway, but I would draw strats. So like we draw out the map on a piece of paper, try to remember all the little details. Then we start drawing like, okay, this is how we're gonna take the A-bomb site. And I'm 13 years old at the time, and the teachers are just like, oh my god, this kid's probably gonna be the next Columbine murderer. So. That was interesting, but I've always loved the game. I still follow it. I have not gotten to play Global Offensive all that much, but I watch pretty much every big event that I can.
So when you were following CS back in the day, who were the players who you just had and naturally were drawn to? Okay, that's why I'm always interested. It's not just the players that were the best, or the one that was the best from your country. It has to be the one where there's something about the style or like the flair or the personality of someone where you resonate with them. Who were the ones that stood out in that sense?
Off the top of my head, 2 of the biggest ones, probably what was his name? I think it was Solo, the Korean player.
Yeah, he's a fantastic player. Project KR.
And Kogu from MIBR. Those were 2
Brazilian,
of 2 of my favorite players to watch. I think with Solo, I was just like, who the hell is this guy? Because the first of when the game started getting big, it was all the Swedish teams. It's like 6 top Swedish teams. Maybe you've got like 1 or 2 North American teams in the mix, and then some other decent. There were some decent German teams. Mouse Sports was good for a while. You had alternate attacks and stuff like that. But I was like, I watched this Korean team, and everyone's expected him just to get eliminated. I'm like, who is this guy? He was just destroying everyone. So I think that really grabbed my attention more, not just because of his individual skill, and he carried that team extremely hard, but also the fact is like, how did he get good? He's in a region where nobody plays, or relatively few people play, at least as far as I knew. So yeah, big Solo fan. Kogu I love just because I felt like he brought like a swagger to the team, and also kind of similar to Solo, where he really was the team in a lot of ways. But I think I generally root for the underdogs, and I wouldn't say those are like the biggest underdog teams, but they're two teams that are never going to have as many fans because they're just not from the main regions where the bulk of the fan base comes from. And I just love a good underdog story, honestly.
Oh, I mean, you've actually picked out two that are good ones there, especially because there's like a connection. They're both like the godlike player, but who comes from the region where it's not even before they arrive. There's not even a team that's good. No one knows who the fuck they. And it's always the same question. It's like, how did this guy get this good? I know in some cases, like in the case of the solo guy you're mentioning, they literally used to just play like in empty servers where they had no one to play against and just practice every aspect of the mechanics and the fundamentals, to some ludicrous degree. So, okay, so if those were the players you're initially drawn to. If you're a caster now and you grew up playing CS, grew up watching CS, were you influenced by Counter-Strike casting at all? Because I know Counter-Strike casting particularly, we had a very special type of hype casting, like the way it would build up during a round and it had to like plateau and then go down again, It had its own flair, I think. Was that an influence at all?
Well, so when I really followed competitive Counter-Strike, it was initially, like, I don't even know if I listened to the commentary. A lot of the times I watched their HLTV and they didn't have it in it.
You didn't have the shoutcasting?
Not at first, but I think there were a couple of, I think it was ESL in like the mid 2000, like first decade of the century, mid 2000s, where I definitely think that I take some of my commentary style from that, not just from Counter-Strike, although I think Counter-Strike's a really good example of it, but in Dota you have that pacing issue with a little bit less like defined breaks. You don't have the round system okay, get excited, round ends, now we can reset. With Dota, it's like big team fight happens, and then hopefully things reset, but maybe people buy back, maybe there's suddenly a base race. So things are a little more variable. But yeah, I definitely think that's something which getting into a rhythm as a commentator is extremely important. I think Counter-Strike's a game that can definitely teach you a lot about that.
Are you someone in terms of casting where the style in general is quite natural? It just that's just the way you did it when you started, or have you actually actively? Is there any kind of approach you've tried to take, or in that sense, what's the balance like? Do you think?
So when I started commentating, I was incredibly boring. I was very dry, very analytical. I got into commentating, so I watched the international. The first international, loved the games. I stayed up all night the first night, and for those who did, they'll remember that the first night, the very first match was, I think it was Spectre versus Weaver, there were only like 6 really good carries, or maybe there were even 3 or 4 in the original Dota 2 client push. And the game they had so many issues. It was like a 4-hour match for 1.5 hours of gameplay, or maybe it was 1 hour of gameplay. So stayed up all night for that, and I had a job at the time. Dota was very much just a kind of a passion and a side hobby. And so I got into commentating. Luminous was the person that I really looked up to at first because I started watching his videos, and I learned a lot from watching them. I considered myself a good pub player, but the funny thing is there wasn't one unified platform, right? There's no matchmaking. There would be little in-house leagues. You had your IHL, and you had DXD. There were a lot of in-house leagues in Warcraft 3, and some of them you had good players emerge from them, but there was no like one unified ranking, right? So everyone's going to naturally think they're better than they are, and that's still an issue now. But at least like you have the number to kind of put people back in their place or give them a dose of reality. But in Dota, you really didn't have that. So I was blown away by how much it was teaching me. Just very analytical style commentaries. Lumi had kind of his own unique wonky sense of humor, so that's how I got into it. And at first I was very boring, and then I didn't get a whole lot of positive feedback. And I wouldn't say I made a conscious effort to be exciting, but there was one game that I was casting. It was in the International 2 Eastern qualifiers, and I only got tapped to cast it because I had a good internet connection. This was when I first worked with Gods. So he was living in Australia, Melbourne. Shit internet, generally the problem for most people who live there. A big reason why you don't really see much of a competitive scene there in Dota, or even in other games. The region generally struggles, but his internet was shit, right? So he couldn't stream. He had been working with a guy named Triumph, and Triumph had done the first Beyond the Summit tournament. It wasn't really a business at the time. It was just a cool name that Gods came up with that he thought sounded like clever, and it wasn't twitch.tv/gods, so other people could cast on that channel. And ended up working with me because he really didn't have any other choice. And there was one moment, and I'm trying to remember the teams that are playing. I think it's escaping me now, but there was an anti-mage, and he was about to die, and he got a bash, and I'd been casting all night. I was all caffeinated, wired up, kind of loopy, and I'm like, he's definitely going to die here. So I'm like, oh, he's going to go down, and then all of a sudden he gets this bash. He ends up getting a kill, and he's got lifesteal, so he's able to just tank the other heroes, and he ends up wiping their entire team. And I just, for whatever reason, something just flipped in my brain. You know, maybe I'd been watching a lot of Toby leading into this or something, and I just went, the bash, the bash. And I think from then on, I slowly began to kind of find a more play-by-play focused style. It was interesting when I started because I think there were almost no professional former pros that were regular commentators. So everyone was a hybrid or just a play-by-play guy. So it was kind of natural to fall into that hybrid role, and everyone would do a bit of analysis, a bit of hyping up the fights, and for whatever reason, I kind of just found myself gravitating more and more towards that, narrative and hopefully peppy, description of what's going on in the game.
That moment's haunted you, hasn't it? I've seen you mention it so many times in AMAs in interviews. It's like someone only has to give the opening. It's like you think, right, I better get in there right now in case they mention that, in case they later on ask, like, why did you get so hyped over that? Why does that one bother you? You seem like such a cool customer otherwise. Is it just because people always cite that as though it happened like last week? Like, oh, look at this guy, does this every game.
Mate, Thorn, you have no idea. So, like, a good example, at TI5 this year. So, okay, bear in mind, I started commentating like 3 months, or I think it was like 4 or 5. I started commentating at the beginning of 2012. So, I started in January. In, I think it was August of that year, I'm casting at Benaroya Hall on the main stage. The last time I had done public speaking, I was in high school. I ran for class president, and I was standing in front of like 300 people, and I got so fucking nervous that my hands were shaking really bad, holding the piece of paper. And the people in the front row could see my hand shaking, and they start giggling, and then everybody else in the auditorium starts laughing. But needless to say, I did not get elected. So I was not a confident public speaker, and I had never done a live event before that. It doesn't really bother me, except that it's just so fucking old at this point, man. Honestly, like, I'm past the point where I'm like, oh, it hurts my self-esteem, or I don't like being made fun of. Like, for a while, I'm like, yeah, it's kind of an embarrassing moment where I got overexcited for something that was not really worth that level of excitement. But it's more just, I walk down to get dinner at TI5, and if there's like any of like 20 people there, they see me, it's wow. It's just like, Jesus Christ, dude, I've got a fucking name. So I don't know, it doesn't really bother me, but I just wish they would find new material at this point. I got to give them something better. That's my issue.
Well, we know your trigger point then, okay, but you've done your best to heal those wounds, hopefully. So we'll move on.
Scabbing over, it's scabbing.
Yeah. So when you became a caster, and you're describing here, like, if people think of you now and as one of the voices of Dota, and they think of the role you take, it's very much like a lot of play-by-play. It's mainly what you're doing. And in terms of this approach, from knowing a lot of play-by-play casters myself over the year in other games, it feels like a lot of them, once they decide and once they get consigned to being the play-by-play, some of them, it's not that they don't follow the game in the way an analyst would, but it's like they kind of think to themselves like, oh, that's just not my thing, like I always have the color caster needs to have all like the stats and all the information about the meta and stuff, and I'll just focus. A lot of them actually, interestingly, will spend their time logically just focusing on stuff like voice training or like reading books by sportscasters. They go full on to like their part of the craft, okay. But I've noticed when you're talking here, and every time you've talked in the past, it sounds like you still have like the mentality of the color commentator, of the analyst guy, who you're trying to watch all the VODs for that reason, and you do always try to sneak some of that into your style, or like how you're setting things up. Is this accurate? Is there a part of you wonders one day, like would you ever have liked to be just the color guy if you could?
If I could, absolutely. I think even if I had the insight, and I definitely don't think I do compared to people like Winter or Cinder and Merlini. But even if I had the insight, in Dota especially, you really have to have the credentials. Almost to the point where I feel like someone could be a superb analyst, but if they were not a former pro, nobody's going to take them seriously, and including a lot of the pro players will just write you off immediately.
Are you concerned that, if they would make they'd make like a judgment call on, like, this player made a key mistake here, if they weren't an ex-pro, then maybe the pros would get mad about that. Fans would be like, how can he say that? Is this the kind of how you characterize what the problem?
Well, yeah, I think it's very much like you have to have the background, is the way a lot of fans look at it. And to me, it definitely, like, obviously if someone has the credentials, then you can take what they say a little bit more seriously, especially if you're not sure if what they're saying is true otherwise. But to me, it also is just laziness in terms of critical thinking. Like, a comment can come, and I hear it from other play-by-play casters. Capitalist comes to mind, where he's a 6K player. He knows the game pretty well. Sure, he's not a former pro. He'll say something, he'll get flamed. People will say he's an idiot. I know I've heard plenty of analysts say the same shit in a similar situation and get praised for it. And it's just a little frustrating when people don't critically think. Like it's definitely fine, and people should consider credentials and consider someone's history and background. And I'm not saying that people should take everything I say analytically the way that they would those analysts, but it's just annoying when people are that lazy mentally. But it's the internet. What can you expect? So, would I like to be an analyst if I could? I would enjoy it. I mean, the cool thing with being an analyst, I think, is there's more diverse options for you, Dota. So you can do panels for some of the big events, like the majors, sure, especially. You can obviously do the co-caster role, and you can still get excited about stuff that's happening. For me, I just can't not do it at all. I definitely over the years I've tried to moderate it, and because ultimately you can end up stealing the material. Let's say you're a perfect analyst and a great hypecaster. You leave no space for your co-caster in some cases. If you do all the analysis, then you do all the hype. It's like what the hell's the point of the other guy? So I always try to leave that space anyway. I think for me I think I can't give up sharing my thoughts on the game if I really feel strongly, because I've been playing the game for 10 years. It's like if you've grown up as a fan of football your whole life. Like you're not just going to sit there when you're watching a match that you care about and you're invested and just not say anything if it's just on your brain or just... Yeah, well, I mean, it's just like, you're casting a match and like you see something that just, it's like, for me, I've cast so much and that I feel like whenever I watch a game, I'm always comparing it to different games, whether it's old metas, the way that a hero used to be played in previous patches, whether it's just different builds between the two different players playing the exact same hero, even in the same patch, and it just kind of comes over me. I just feel like compelled to say something. I don't know, it kind of eats away at you to just not, at least to not broach it as a topic of conversation. So, I mean, I think that's definitely what makes me unique compared to pretty much every other more play-by-play commentator in Dota, is that I think I bring a lot more in the way of like historical examples and just can speak a little more fluently about the way that players used to build their heroes, their old metas, different styles. I guess in some sense it's somewhat similar to what you do in Counter-Strike, where you're the self-professed historian of CS. So I wouldn't quite be willing to say I'm the historian of Dota, but I think there's an element of me that I just always feel compelled to bring it up.
Sure. Are you someone where the importance of the match, is that like significant to you? Do you still, like, if it was the best teams imaginable, they're playing a match, but it was just like a smaller LAN, or it wasn't with, you didn't have a big crowd, or occasionally, I mean, not as much nowadays, but you're doing it online or something, is that an issue for you at all? I mean, there's some people where they've done so many games, it has to be like the big match, it has to be like the big stage game that to really get them fully going. What is it like for you in general? Like, what's your appetite still like?
So I started commentating Chinese Dota especially, and Southeast Asian Dota as well. So the regions that I was covering didn't really have that much viewership or general attention. I mean, this was when Reddit was hardly even a thing. But whether it's Gosu Gamers or Join Dota, like, people would tune in to watch the broadcasts, and decent numbers, and they actually grew pretty rapidly after the international too. But when I started, the teams, I didn't actually know a lot of the teams that well. I had not followed the Dota scene closely at all before I started commentating. I think I had watched a handful of replays when I was in college, when I kind of found out there was a competitive scene, but my heart was always with Counter-Strike, and Dota was always my like chill game. Like, if I want to break, I'll go play some Dota, fuck around a bit, pick Juggernaut, and just run at people and try to omni-slash them, and it's a way to unwind. But I think for me, what I quickly found was that I get really annoyed when like, not that fans have allegiances, but when I feel like they're unreasonably blind fans. And it's a part of any sport, it comes with the territory. But I think partially as a reaction to that, I really made a concerted effort to always bring as much, if not more, energy to games where that would normally not be as exciting. So obviously, I mean, when I started casting, I would have like 12, 18-hour benders, where I'd basically cast nonstop. Like, you're running from the room to get more coffee, get more water, go to the bathroom, maybe eat something for 5 minutes, and you're doing your own production. This was long before there really were many studios. Even Toby just had a one-man operation at Joy Dota for a long time. So you grind basically, and it's tough to keep your energy up, especially if you're solo casting. And especially when it comes to the Asian Dota back then, there wasn't that much interest. So I also didn't have many connections. So finding people to co-cast was extremely difficult. So energy would tend to flag. And I think over time I've gotten better at being consistent with my energy, where obviously if you're at a live event, you just feel something. I mean, you've been to some, right? So you know how it is. Like, you feel the crowd, they're cheering, they're excited. Like, it definitely gives you that little extra pep, and it probably puts a little skip in your step, but I try to be as consistent as I can, and ultimately I think it's just mainly live events, if there's an audience, where you're always going to bring a little bit more, whether you think you're perfectly balanced or not.
So one of the interesting things in an esports context as a caster is that in Dota, like you're mentioning here, there are like studios, and there's people who are casters who get to be directly involved with production, which is actually reasonably unique if you look across esports. You know, nowadays, maybe in the last few years, people in some other games have been hired by like a main developer or someone. So now some of them do have more say or are integrated more. But I know a lot of casters, especially coming from games like Counter-Strike and Quake, where they really were the guys who, listen, they did all the on-camera stuff, but the second the mic went off, you know, like that's it. They didn't get any say in what was happening in their ear or on screen. What has it been like in terms of being able to directly decide some of the stylistic things in that sense, or the vibe of how the event's going to be set up with all the stuff you've been doing? What do you think of that kind of aspect? Was that naturally something you were into? Did you have to grow to do it? What's it like?
I don't think I could live without it, to be honest. So when I started commentating, I joined Dota Commentaries, which was not a studio. It was a website that did regular replay casts, because originally there were live broadcasts. I think Toby was the main guy who was doing some, I believe Cinder and Mad Mortigan and Blitz, and there was someone else who was in their group who did a couple of live casts, but they were extremely uncommon in Dota. The vast majority of commentary was over replays, and you make a YouTube VOD, and Illuminous probably the big person that comes to mind who really pioneered that. So when I started, I was part of a team, and I was very green. I went to TI2. I mean, it's a combination, obviously, of hard work and luck. Getting there, I wasn't that well known. It came down to who Luminous wanted to cast with. He ended up telling Dice Froggy wanted to cast with me, so I get to the main event. I got some lucky games, just amazing Dota. I made the best of it, and from there, the doors just open. It's really, I think almost every commentator or on-camera talent kind of has that story. Probably the main exception would be former pros who already have their fan base and then retire. But if you're coming up, and you're not known for your gameplay or for your personality, maybe if you're a Purge, it's different. You always have that moment. So TI2 was that moment for me. The play, the most iconic that comes to mind, the Navi vs IG game there. And so after that, I had a job offer from Join Dota, and Gods did as well. And Beyond the Summit was not a business at this time. It wasn't even really a full-time project. We had run 2 tournaments. We hosted the International 2 Eastern qualifiers, which was basically him. I just streamed and commentated. He did all the administration on his end. And I really thought about the offer. I mean, Toby was the best at the time, and he's a fantastic commentator today. And I was very green. I definitely looked up to him. I felt like he was a better commentator overall than me, and I was honestly shocked that Valve gave me the grand finals, and I definitely wasn't the only one. So I really thought about joining them. But the thing that ultimately made me not want to go is I really like having some control over what I do and basically being my own boss. I like working for myself. I've had a lot of different jobs over the years. Some of them more independent gigs that I kind of do my own thing, and some where I've worked for other companies. And I'm not going to say I hated every minute of working for other companies, but it's just those moments where, they're doing something stupidly, and you want to do it a different way, but you just have no ability to influence the decision. And some companies like Valve, they're a bit better, where everyone's more empowered, but your standard business, that's generally not the case. And I think I looked at Join Dota, and not even having worked there, not even knowing what it was really like, I just kind of assumed, Toby's always going to be the top dog because he's Toby, he's way more established. I'm never going to get to really do my own thing. I won't even really get to choose which games I cast. I won't have much control over the way productions are done. And back then, there was no production for online broadcasts of Dota. The production would be, the camera shot comes on, you see the commentator behind the desk, you go into the game, you cast the game, you go back to the camera shot for 5 seconds, and you go to a wait screen. So that was it. That was it for every online broadcast. And that was better than most, where they just wouldn't even have a camera shot, and they would just go straight to the game and then back to a wait screen. So there wasn't much filler content. And so I think we had a lot of ideas about how to improve production quality, and this was before Chinese Dota was really covered at all. So ultimately, that was the big thing for me, was I felt like we could do a better job of going beyond just the basic game coverage. And I think a lot of it we were inspired by the International too, because you compare TI2 to now, TI5, and I mean, Valve's advanced the storytelling so much further. I mean, last year is a great example of how they screwed up in that department, but TI2 still, compared to most tournaments, told stories much better. You had player interviews. They still had some team profiles. They did the post-event video, I believe, kind of recapping some of the key moments and basically painting the picture of how the event unfolded. So we really wanted to tell those stories, and especially for a lot of the Asian teams where, I mean, even today, there's still, you see it in every esport, whether it's StarCraft with the Korean robots, or I know League of Legends has that to some extent with the Chinese and the Korean players. And Dota's been very guilty of it, where, look at last TI. Though people rooted for Vici Gaming over Newbie, by and large, out of the Western scene, because they knew RTK, but they hardly knew the guy at all. They just knew that he was animated and he yelled a lot. Like, that's your average Western fan's understanding of him, and they compare that to Newbie, they're like, okay, well, at least this guy, you know, has a personality, so I'm going to root for them. But that was our original goal when we set out. So the first event we did, the G1 League Season 4, I think it was, at the end of 2012. It was December that year. That was the first Chinese Dota tournament that was ever live broadcast to a Western audience. And originally, they were going to make us broadcast on the Chinese platform, which would have been an absolute train wreck. But we were able to convince them, nobody could watch this. We can't even stream to this shit. So, you know, come on, let us broadcast on Twitch. You know, you're not even paying us anyway. We're just doing this to give you guys English coverage. It can only help you. And I feel like we really went the extra mile there. There were a lot of interviews of players at that event. They're all in Chinese, and we got some Team Liquid community members, coupons. Shout out to him. Still, he translated them, put in subtitles. There was actually a really interesting moment, which I don't think I've ever seen since then, where IG got filmed in the middle of a BO5 Grand Finals, yelling at each other about what had happened in one of their losses to LGD, and it was filmed, published by media. We subtitled it. You got like the kind of insight that like you'll never be able to get today. So it was, you know, I guess that was kind of the Wild West in a lot of ways. China was far more established and had more of a, you know, a structured scene than the West, but still, it wasn't the way it is now. And then you go forward to TI4. Perfect example is DK literally having their room bugged with microphones.
Yeah.
By oh god, who was it? I think it was GameFi. Yeah, and so now they're not allowed to go to TI anymore. So I mean, things have changed a lot in terms of what kind of access teams will allow. But we got a lot of that content, and you know, we even showed the Chinese stream, which was pretty unprecedented. I mean, it's not really that hard, but people just didn't think to do it back then. So going back to your original question, it was always for me the biggest thing was I want to be able to do things my way. And that's not to say I'm always going to do them correctly, but I feel like I learn better that way, and more importantly, I'm way more motivated. Working for other people, I'll still bring my A game if it's something I'm passionate about, but it's hard not to get frustrated if things are not going the way that you think they should, and you know, just kind of clam up a bit.
It does feel like one of the things that's made casting in Dota 2 just get better year on year is the inclusion of the ex-pros or the people who are still currently pros, that you obviously like Malini, fucking Mad, all these guys. If there's someone where you think to yourself, like, this guy, you know him behind the scenes maybe, or even his on-camera personality is great in this sense, who are the people where the second these guys finish being a pro, like, you just hope they want to come on analysis desks, they want to do casting? Who would the ones right now be where, if it was your dream, you know, you could harvest these guys in a couple of years, who would you want to come for the pros and get involved in this side? Who'd be good?
Oh god, there's actually a surprisingly large number, I think, in Dota. I think the one that probably comes to mind for me first, who to me is, I think he's the total package, and in a lot of ways better than a lot of current commentators, is probably No-Tail. He's casted a few of the summits. The thing with No-Tail is, obviously, he's an amazing player. He's played on a ton of top teams. He's not won TI, but he's competed and gotten very far and performed quite well at big events and played with the best players in the game. You know, looking at whether it's Secret or Fnatic, he's always been an extremely talented player, and he just brings energy, man. He's more hyper than, you know, even like an OD Pixel or Toby a lot of the time. He'll be jumping out of his chair when he's at the summit. He's like screaming, and you know, when we're running the event, like normally the players are really quiet, right? See, the mics have to get gained out a lot just so that you can even hear like Kuroki quietly, you know, whispering or mumbling. With No-Tail, like, you got to gate him more than a regular commentator. The compression we had to put on his microphone was absolutely absurd. So I think out of every pro player that's currently active, he's the one that comes to mind first. Is the total package, great analysis, very direct and concise as well. Some players, I think a lot of pros kind of ramble a bit when they're trying to explain, and I think it's partially because they're not really sure what level of knowledge to assume on behalf of the viewer. Yeah. They're trying to find a way to like say you're stupid but still being polite. That's not what we should be talking about. But No Tail will just cut right to it. So I think he's definitely the first one that comes to mind. PPD is fantastic. He's very dry, and at first I thought he was really boring, but he's actually got a very good sense of humor. It's just kind of a unique one. Like he'll burn somebody, but it won't be in like a very over the top kind of way. It's a little subtle jab, and then you're like, oh, I see what you did there. So those are two that off the top of my head. Let's see, who else? Black is fantastic as well. He commentated at the One Summit. He's just funny. Like I can't take Black too seriously. He's kind of a goofy guy in general. If you ever meet him at a live event, he's one of those people that like everyone will just kind of see them and just start like they'll kind of start smiling and then you just start laughing at them. Like it's just and you both mutually are giggling together. He's just a joy to commentate with, and I think brings like just kind of a fun aspect to the cast that a lot of pro players, great insight, can be very boring for your average viewer. But those are probably three off the top of my head. Okay. But I think at Dota we're blessed with actually a lot of pros that.
Yeah.
Well, blessed for the viewers, maybe cursed for the current analysts if those players ever retire.
Understandable. Okay, so one of the things you kind of touched on before is that because, well, I mean, there's so many great Chinese teams, Chinese region players who we know, despite the fact we don't speak Chinese, some of them must have brilliant insights or like really unique perspectives on the game. But again, beyond stuff like rare pieces where someone subtitles it, or one of them, I mean, some of them actually do have some good English, especially the ones that lived in more westernized countries, Singapore or wherever it might be. If you could, on the same kind of question I asked before, if you could pick one where at the moment he's like a purely Chinese guy only, like maybe he doesn't even speak English, but this would be the dream guy. If this guy somehow could communicate in perfect English, we could bring him on to be like an analyst or a color commentator. Who's the guy where, obviously you can't actually know, but that you're intrigued by this guy, that he seems like he has a brilliant perspective on the game, or he'd have an interesting way of seeing things. Who do you think you'd want?
So I think for pure total package, kind of the No Tail of the East, you have to say RTK. The guy is just a personality. We brought him to the first summit, and he was on Vici Gaming at the time. They ended up finishing 4th out of 6 teams. They got knocked out. I think it was only a 4-day event. I think they got knocked out at the end of day 2 or beginning of day 3. He was the only Chinese player at that event, and this was the first summit, right? Like the players had no idea what to expect. They had never seen a home story cup. There certainly had never been anything like this in Dota, so they were, oh, this is very weird. I'm not sure how to react. We had a viewing party, which was like 10, 15 minutes from the house. So we bring RTK to he's the only player who volunteered to go to the viewing party out of both of the Chinese teams. DK actually had to play in the grand finals, but when they got eliminated, they didn't want to go at all. I think Ice ended up going because we kind of, tugged on his ear. Come on, man. There's a lot of fans there wanting to see you. But RTK, just been eliminated. He's like, great, I'm going to go. Goes there. He sits down. He doesn't, especially back then, he didn't speak much English. I think he understands it quite a bit better nowadays. But he was just, all smiles, socializing with all the fans. He actually ended up leaving with a bunch of fans. It's like, I'm going to go with these guys. And like, you're in a foreign country. You don't really speak the language. You've just met these people. So, yeah, I'll see you guys later. Like, okay. He's a character, and I've seen like snippets of some of his commentary, and he's just a very funny guy in general, it sounds like. So I think he's the total package. As far as just like the player whose insight into the game I'm most interested in, I think it's just got to be Xiao. I don't even think that's really a debate at this point. Maybe in a year or two it will change, but this is a guy that is probably the only captain in China who you can RTK maybe. But I think Xiao more so, really the only captain in China you can say has consistently been on the level or near the level of a PPD or a Puppy over the past few years, and he's been in the scene for a very long time. He's been to, I think, every TI. I think he's been to every TI, actually. I'm not sure about TI1 offhand, but Xiao he's the mastermind. He's the guy that, like, you bring him in, and like if you could just change one player on a team and have the biggest possible impact, Xiao is in that. He's in like that special S tier category of like the only, like the best possible move for a team if they lack a strong captain. Nothing can have more of an impact. And I think you look at like teams like Big God, the guy has done it all. Big God, he actually was beating people 1v1 mid, and historically Xiao, the big knock on his play was that he's not a bad laner, but the laning stage isn't really his strength. He's much more of just an excellent decision maker in the clutch, a great captain late game, and just has a very good ability to formulate a game plan that fits the team and that's going to work in the current meta. But at DAC, he was just crushing people 1v1 mid, just straight up outplaying a lot of the world's best players. So, I mean, he's played every role. He played off lane at TI2, he's played support. I think the only role actually he hasn't played is safe lane carrier or one position, but I feel like he's been such a pioneer for the Chinese scene that I would, and he is the director. Like, he's always the guy that's commanding his team. I mean, more so than a lot of other captains, maybe even to a fault that it sounds like he's a bit of a dictator. Of course, I haven't gotten to talk too much because I don't speak a lick of Chinese, and he's a bit on the shyer side, I think, with the non-Chinese speaking members of the community, but you can just tell watching the way he interacts with his team, like, this guy is the boss. He is the alpha male of the team. He's in charge, and I would just love to see what he has to say about games. You get to see PPD and Puppycast from the summit, but yeah, we've never gotten to see what Xiao 8 thinks in that kind of environment. So I think those would be my big two from the Eastern scene.
One of the things that's great about Dota 2 that I really enjoy as a spectator is the amount of tools you guys have. Like, even now that are built into the client and on casts, etc. There's other games where some of these things that, you know, no one can even conceive of having extra tools to help the caster or to help the viewer keep it. And so, and obvious ones like the gold graphs, etc. That's like a really good invention. But I mean, there's things that you guys were involved in, like the team fight recaps and stuff. Is there anything where at the moment nothing like this exists, or you don't know how you'd implement it, but do you have any like a little concept for us, like, I wish we could somehow have this would be like, it could bring out another side to things? Is there anything you're thinking of? Some innovation we could see one day, maybe, or in a dream world if it was possible, you know?
It's too bad we didn't do this interview 4 months ago, because we actually wanted to do the projection mapping thing before Valve did it at TI, okay. But the problem is we don't run a large-scale live event, right? So we do a house-based tournament. So we were going to do like a small kind of intro at the viewing party, just to kind of, as a proof of concept. But, you know, we ended up not having a viewing party the last summer. Then Valve did it and did an amazing job with it. So that would have been what I told you 4 months ago. Nowadays, I think Dota is just it's pretty complete, honestly. Like, the team fight recap's really good. The graphs are good. I think making statistics more easily available in some sort of automated way would be great. Like, right now, you've got to Alt-Tab, go to Dat Dota, you know, the stats men, and this is kind of a role in Dota. I know it doesn't really exist as much in other games, and certainly not as much in Counter-Strike. Like, they'll have to go research hero statistics outside of the client, but I feel like there should be a way to kind of dig into a player's info through the game client itself. So that would be cool. It's not really a total landscape shift. What are some other... I don't know if I can give you all my ideas here, Thor. No, I'm coming up a little blank. The team fight recap was I think it was one of the things we've done that I'm proudest of. That, hey, if it's good enough for Valve to add it to the game, then you know it must be something that really makes a difference. I'm not a huge fan of their implementation, to be honest. I think it's too much. It's too info dense. It's not as easy to read as the concept we came up with originally. But okay. And it's also buggy. Like, the numbers are often wrong, from what all the stats men tell me. There's some problems with the way the formulas are calculated, but. Yeah, that's definitely up there, and I don't know if other games really have anything like that. I guess Counter-Strike, when you die, it'll like tell you, it'll give you the, you know, who damaged you stats. Yeah. It's really unique, though. I
mean, maybe as a joke, what I was going to go with is they could have like the cast on like a 10-second buffer, you know, so the guy on the production knows what's coming, and then when you're casting a really great moment, he could add in like 1960s Batman style, like those graphics that used to come up in the fight, like pow, wow. In your case, it'd be like wow, burning across the bottom of the screen, you know, like loads of views or something. Maybe that would spice up some casts, I think.
Oh, you know, that reminds me of like some of the Korean casts that have been subtitled, where they'll have like the crazy, like colorful letters just
the great out. Like the Chinese one where they were doing that super long game, and they had a similar scenario where it was like where there was those like 2-hour games or whatever, and they had it across the screens. It was good for comedic value, I have to say.
It was pretty entertaining. I still get salty about that cast though, because that was actually an incredibly interesting game from an analytical point of view, and. You know,
they didn't give a fuck, though, did they?
Yeah, they're just like, fuck this shit, this is boring, let's flame the players and make fun of how boring this game is and how long it is, and, you know, haha, Chinese Dota so slow, but that was, to me, that was actually one of the most interesting games of that TI, and, I mean, I think it was just a bit unfortunate that, people, you know, your average viewer can't sit there, and I get it, but I want people to appreciate the minutia a little bit more. And so it's tricky if it's two Chinese teams, especially. Like your average Western viewer is like, fuck this. If it's Secret versus EG and it's the same type of game, then they're more likely to pay attention.
Okay, so on that topic, that's a problem I feel Dota has had, actually. Because sometimes people from other games, if they see me tweet about Dota or I did something vaguely related, they'll be like, you really follow that game? Especially, people from fucking League of Legends or whatever. Like, what, you follow that game? And I'll be like, yeah, why not? It's great. They'll be like, I notice a lot of the ones who are biased against it, that's the problem. They watched during that era where there were like really drawn out games, especially the Chinese teams would sometimes, it's like they felt like they stalled them out forever, So unfortunately, I think people have got like a weird bias that they think that that's what Dota is now even. Whereas obviously now it's incredibly fast paced, it's a lot more decisive, and way more kills for start off. So what I want to ask is this, how could the game veer so drastically in the spectrum of how dynamic it is in that sense? So what do you think decides those factors?
I think it purely comes down to the brilliance of IceFrog and the balanced team. It's not just IceFrog, which is kind of a common misconception, although obviously he is the mastermind and the puppeteer, but he has a really loyal and dedicated team of beta testers, many of whom have been with him since probably I started playing Dota, which is 9 years ago, something like that, or maybe it's even closer to 10 at this point. So that team, to me, I just don't think there's anything comparable to it. If you look at any game that's been consistently balanced and tweaked for this long, like, sure, you have games that were absolutely incredible to watch. Brood War comes to mind. CS Counter-Strike 1.6, and so even some of the earlier versions, you could argue, were even more interesting and dynamic to watch. But those games stopped getting balanced, right? They kind of finalized the patch and the game ended. Games that have been consistently balanced and tweaked and changed and drastically revamped, like, I can't think of any other game in esports that's actually been, I wouldn't say every patch has been great, but on the whole has been consistently excellent. So, I mean, to me, you just have to take your hat off to the balanced team. I think that's probably Dota's biggest asset as an esport that no other game has. Is just the best in developers in the business as far as making the competitive gameplay interesting while still keeping the pub experience. I mean, not great. Everyone, there's always going to be a broken hero that everyone bitches about, but whether it's your techies, Lashrak, or Tinker from the past, or whatever the case may be. But I think the balance team is probably the X factor there. I also think they're more willing to experiment. Like, if I don't really follow League very closely. I know that at least for a while there's been like kind of a very consistent meta, right? Like you always have, your top laner. It's usually the AD carry, then mids like the AP carry. You've got the dual lane and the safe lane and the jungler. Like that's just always how it is, right? Am I off base there?
Yeah. It's a static meta.
I think part of it is that Valve is just willing to make bigger changes. They moved the Roshan pit. Like they completely changed the creeps. They added an aura to one of the ancient creeps that gives everything near it more HP. So it's just like dynamic changes. Like everything in Dota is kind of overpowered in a way. Like if you look at almost every hero, there's an ability where it's like, wait, what? That's just an ability? That's bullshit. And everything sounds kind of broken, but everything's broken, and therefore I think Dota finds its kind of very unique balance in that sense. And there are some hero concepts that are like slightly similar, but I think by and large, to me, Dota has the most unique hero concepts out of any MOBA, and that's probably the other thing. It's just that they're not afraid as a development team to do things that are radically different and are going to dramatically shift the game. Whereas I think it seems to me as an outsider, and not being in the war room with these balanced teams, like with like whether it's StarCraft 2, League, CS:GO, it feels like they just don't have much of a development team, so that's kind of a separate issue. But for those two guys in particular, it feels like they're kind of afraid to mess with the formula too much. Whereas to me, IceFrog he's not afraid to just he added like 5 new items in the last patch, completely reworked a bunch of heroes, bunch of the usual tweaks and number changes, and smaller skill updates. He's not afraid to just basically throw it all against the wall and then start reorganizing it, which to me is something I think after a long time a lot of developers they're afraid to experiment. They know it's a solid formula, and they don't want to take the risk that they screw it up entirely and it's no longer a game that anyone wants to play.
So on the topic I was talking about when I was talking about like how extreme it got with some of those super long Chinese games where if you didn't know what was happening, you thought nothing was happening for 40 minutes, even though obviously there was. People were like posturing up or trying to feint with each other, etc. those are the games where it's understandable that the most casual viewer or someone who just doesn't have experience very much with the game is going to be turned off by that. They're the ones who are like, that's boring, like I don't want to see that play. So you kind of alluded to what you think about it, because obviously you kind of implying you really appreciate those games to a degree. I want to get into that, okay? Because the thing is, in games myself, maybe because I've played for so long and I'm interested in the analytical side, I have kind of a sickness where I actually really like that sort of thing in games. Like I really love in Counter-Strike where it's what seems like a really slow, really boring match where it's like very slight variations on the tactic they're running, but if you know the tiny little nuance of what's happening, you're like, it's blowing your mind, you know, the implications of what it means and then what's going to build the game within the game and all that sort of stuff. And I actually always, my analogy for it usually is, if anyone watches MMA, one of the most popular fighters of the last decade, okay, was George St. Pierre, but actually people always used to complain that his title fights were really boring, because it used to just be him basically wrestling the dude for the majority of the time, using like really fundamental boxing, and he was never knocking anyone out, he was never submitting anyone. But the thing was, if you knew MMA and you knew how insanely good all the people he were fighting was, then you knew that like actually the genius was he was like neutralizing all their strengths basically. And so the fact that they weren't doing anything in a weird way, the omission of actual action was what was blowing your mind. Like, oh my god, how's he doing this? You know, and then there was a beauty to watching that. So you're gonna have to really earn your money right here when I ask you this. How were you able to enjoy all those super long fucking drag out games? But come on, how were those beautiful to you, LD? What was the appreciation of those? Come on.
Okay, so I think you really touched on something when you said you have to really follow the game closely to appreciate it. Like if you've never seen a baseball game before, right? You've no idea what baseball is. This is a game that could, in theory, go forever, because you could be tied and just keep on having extra innings, and there's no set end in sight. That sounds incredibly boring, but there's this whole chess match in baseball where, you know, you only have so many relievers available. They all have better matchups, whether it's versus lefties or righties, or maybe one guy's got a good sinker and this batter's not very good against that, or this curveball is going to be great here. You know, but once you change out that pitcher, you're done with him for the rest of the match, and you don't know which inning's going to be the last, and you don't know. You kind of have this idea like this part of the lineup is where we're most likely to get our hit. So there's a whole chess match happening behind the scenes. But if you don't follow the game, you have to first of all know the game, know a bunch of the different pitches. You have to know the hitters' tendencies. You have to know what matchups they do well in. Some of this can be illustrated to you by the broadcast, but I think if you don't come in with a lot of that basic information, unless like you take a drug that makes you love baseball, you're like, this is like watching paint dry. So I think I don't think
that drug exists, by the way.
No, unfortunately. Yeah, I like going to baseball games, but I can't say watching them on TV is generally the most exciting. But I think a good example to me, not from Dota, but actually from Counter-Strike, is, do you remember when the money system started to get figured out? I think it might have been Moto. Was one of the first captains.
It was in like sort of 2002, 2003 era, yeah. Because the thing was, at the time, people found there were like weird nuance. I can see where you're going with this, because the thing was, what happened was they essentially figured out that if you saved and didn't engage on certain rounds where like you had a slight disadvantage, it was slightly better for you in a weird way. So you could control the economic aspect in a way which didn't make sense in Counter-Strike, because the basic currency of Counter-Strike, I mean, it's unfortunate you were using an economic sense. The currency, essentially, of a round, the dynamic is the kills. That's what's going to decide what then happens, and you're always heading towards something, killing them all, or getting the bomb down. But as I'm guessing you're leading to here, there would be times where people just saved the guns, and so if you were a fan, you were like, this is bullshit, like, the round's over. It was boring, you know.
And you'd have times where teams would just literally camp the entire round, because it was going to hurt the other team more if you're terrorists and you don't get the bomb down and then get some additional kills. It's terrible to watch if you don't know what's going on. You're like, what the hell is this? And okay, it doesn't make for the best entertainment, but I still appreciate the level. I still appreciate the fact that these players can go next level and really push the boundary of the game. And in Dota, there's examples that can often be exciting, and there's examples that can be incredibly boring. So flip side of this is sometimes you have things which they push the boundary and they're also exciting to watch. Perfect example would be Alliance at the G1 League Season 5, which I think was shortly before TI3. So this was when Liquid and Alliance were the two Western teams playing against. They're basically running the gauntlet of all the top Chinese teams. I think it might have been not the first Chinese event ever to have Western teams, but I think the first big Dota 2 event in China that had any Western teams. And that was the tournament where Alliance pulled out the level 1 TP mid Roche strat. So normally in Dota, if you go for level 1 Roche, teams would smoke there or just run there and then just try to do it quickly. But Alliance had actually figured out that if you TP to the mid tower, and this was when Roche was a bit closer to that mid lane for the Dire side, and you just run there with the right lineup, it's actually impossible to stop the Roche attempt unless the Radiant team anticipates it and TPs to mid. And so you win either way, because if you don't go into Roche, and they've blown a bunch of TPs to get there, and you just play out the game normally, they've wasted a bunch of gold and resources. And if you do go, and they don't gamble, and go for that, which, I mean, who would expect it? It had not been done. I think someone later found it had been done once in Dota 1, like, 6 years ago, but it wasn't even a big name match from what I recall reading about the history of it. So it basically had never been done before in a major match. And so it was just this brilliant maneuver. And that's like kind of the other side of the spectrum, where it's exciting and it's a very aggressive move, but it's also incredibly savvy and intelligent. But I mean, for me, it's obviously great if it's also exciting, and that adds a little bit of spice. But I just like the build-up, because if a game's slow and it's boring in Dota, shit always gets crazy late game in Dota. You've got buybacks, you've Aegis, you've Cheese. Heroes are going to have 6, 7 items easily. Sometimes you have the situation where, like, you'll have multiple crows flying around. Sometimes players are just buying a crow solely for the purpose of scouting. Ice is an example of a player who actually helped win a game for his team by scouting with I think it was a third courier for the team, just flying over the trees, finding, I want to say it was a Sandkid or an Earthshaker that was trying to counter-initiate when DK went high ground. Like, the later the Dota gets, almost guaranteed the more absurd it's going to get. So I think most play-by-play commentators, they might not enjoy the ride. I enjoy the ride as well. But they definitely all love the payoff, which is, it's going to get wild if it's 90, 120 minutes in, even like 60 to 80. Things just start getting weird in Dota. I think more so than pretty much any other game, to be honest. It's such a... I don't think there's many games where you can go from having, like, basically your entire base standing, and then you screw up one fight and like up until that point you have 2 lanes of Rax advantage and map control, to suddenly you lose your gem, you lose the Aegis, heroes buy back and die again, your base is getting blown up, and you get mega creeped all of a sudden. Like that's like suddenly scoring, like, 6 goals in a game of football, and in a matter of just a couple of seconds. It's crazy how quickly things can swing. So I would say it's 2 things. First of all, I appreciate just the chess match and the subtler aspects, and that's why I really love casting with Winter, because he can bring to light a lot of those things that even most other analysts can't. And then I love the chess match part of it, and you just know it's going to be wild when it goes late. So I think those are to me, the 2 big things that make me a masochist, where I actually enjoy these crazy, boring for 80 minutes, but then wild at the last 10 kind of games.
So one thing that I've noticed that has always puzzled me, because I've never seen anyone give a good kind of like basis for why this could be, is that Dota 2, compared to any other esport team game I've seen, bizarrely has more examples of people using stand-ins and doing as good as the original lineup, which might have been very good anyway, or even better sometimes. I mean, obviously a ridiculous one was the Big God one, where they weren't even a team and they just did pretty well when you consider it. And then you've obviously got the Fnatic team when they had the whole problems with Era, etc. E.g. at the TI, where they went that far with Mason. And then, I mean, if you want to go way back in time, the Speed Gaming one where they won with RTZ. Is there something about Dota 2 as a game? Can you think of what the reasons could be as to how you could bring someone in who's not even a part of your team? Maybe he's never played with your team, and like right at that event, you could have incredible success. Is there something about the game or the dynamic you can think of that could lend towards this? Because in other games, just the background, it's extremely unlikely. Like, this is like a once in a blue moon thing that could ever happen. You're almost certain to play worse,
Well, I think part of it is selection bias, to be totally honest. Like, for those are the ones that you remember, but for every one of those, I've cast, dozens of games where a team has some stand-in that either plays like shit or forces the team to play a style they're not comfortable with, or their mid has to play support, or suddenly the captain's in the carry role and this new guy's supporting, and he doesn't really work well with the other support. So I think part of it is selection bias. So the thing with Big God is that, since you brought that up, that's kind of a special case to me, because first of all, you have Xiao 8 probably could take 4 complete noobs and still make a decent team out of them. This guy is top 3 captains in the history of Dota, not just currently active, but who have ever played. Oh, I guess now he's a coach or a backup, but so I think that makes the team special. They had a lot of veteran players as well. Who did they have? ROTK. Was a DDC Lanham, I want to say. I forget the exact roster. Maybe it was MMY, but I think that particular group of players was, if you take 5 newer players and just randomly throw them together, they're not going to have the results of a big god. But that team had the leadership, the veteran experience, where you can kind of get away with it. I haven't really seen many examples in CS:GO or in League where you have stand-ins. I think also in Dota there just are more cases where there are stand-ins, because up until now there's been no roster system at all from Valve, aside from, once you get invited to TI, you can't change your roster unless it's like a very special scenario, like when Fear was injured before TI. But in League, you've got a very structured, top-down, organized system by Riot. CS:GO, not quite the same, but it seems like there's more. Instead of having the huge events, like the once-a-year big event like TI, you've got the more consistent major system, and then even, I don't know what you call them, mini-majors, like the 250K tournaments that don't have the stickers, basically. And it seems like there's a lot of them nowadays. So I think because of that, it encourages, it discourages stand-ins, right? Because there's always something really big to play for. Yeah. Whereas in Dota, up until this year, this is going to be the first time ever, there's like 9 months out of the year where there's something to play for, but mostly it's just about getting ready for TI. And you saw this with the old Na'Vi after TI2, where they did not take the game very seriously, it looked like, as an outsider, did not practice much going into TI3, going into TI4, very much the same story as the players themselves have said. So I think part of it's structural, where there are just more stand-in opportunities in general with Dota, and as a result, you're going to have, the more opportunities you have, you're going to have some crazy outliers. Even in the case of EG, Mason, I don't think that works if that's a weaker team outside of him. Like if you don't have a strong captain like PPD, I don't think that works at all. Okay. So I think a lot of it's only certain teams where it works. They have to have a very strong core group, someone who's a veteran, who the players respect, who they will listen to, and who will be able to lead them. But if you have those circumstances, I mean, most Dota players have played every role, whether it's in pubs, they're very familiar with all the heroes, so I guess in that sense, players are pretty versatile and adaptable. I don't know how much that compares to League, where it seems like players kind of, just for my very casual watch once in a while, I'll tune into LCS, it seems like players pretty much just practice their one role, like just
their specialists, pretty much.
Exactly. Yeah. So I think it's a little bit harder to plug and play. And when you have a stand-in, you might have to change roles, right? If the guy you bring in is just a solo mid player, and that's what he excels at, or his hero pool is all the current mid heroes, then he's kind of forced to mid. So then you've got to adapt to that. And maybe in other games, that's an issue where the players just aren't practicing in a way that allows them to easily adjust.
So listen, I don't know how close you are with Valve, how critical you're willing to be, but you referenced there the roster lock issue. Now, on one hand, some kind of roster lock, it's easy to see the benefits of this, okay? You're not going to end up with a stupid scenario where an entire team goes to a tournament they've been invited to and they've got one player or something. There's some leeway here. But is it not an issue that it's all 5? Does that not cause problems?
Well, I don't know 100% what Valve's reasoning is. I do know one of the things that they've mentioned before is that, I mean, it's pretty clear just from the way that they structure everything with their esports program, well, TI and now with the majors, that in a lot of ways I think Valve feels that, and it's not unfair, that a lot of teams historically have taken advantage of players. So I think the way that they structure it, it's designed to protect the players as much as possible. And that's a big part of why they do it, but it gets tricky, right? Like Fnatic last year was a really good example where it's one thing when it's an organization versus the players. Then you just take the player side. But what do you do when it's 4 players versus 1 player? And I think it's one thing when it's just TI as well, but now that it is the majors, I don't know. I think we don't have data yet. It's really going to depend how this goes, but I know in general the players, they thought the roster lock was way too soon, because there's basically no tournaments for these guys before. There's maybe a couple of small online cups, but especially for the top teams that, maybe finished 1 through 12 at TI, or most of their players did, they have no way to prove themselves before the major invites come out, or they'll have a little bit of an opportunity, but not much. It's only a month or so, and they also don't, and they're stuck with that team. So, who knows? Maybe Eternal Envy and Puppey are actually going to hate each other. They're trapped. They're trapped for the future, and it can be frustrating. I think what's weird about it is not that there's a roster lock, but it feels like it's too close to when the events end. Like, from what I've been told, it sounds like the winter roster lock is tentatively planned for like very early December, like sometime in the first week. So that's if the fall major is in the middle of November, which is roughly when Valve said it's going to be. Same thing. It's like 2-3 weeks to set your roster. I guess in theory, like at least you'll have maybe a week or two to play together, but it's the same issue where you don't really know if the team's going to work. And sure, it does encourage stability, but the thing is, the teams are still going to change their rosters like crazy after every major if they think that there's even a slight shot that they can do better with a new group. There's no incentive for players to stay together in Dota really right now, aside from the direct invites to majors. But if you don't think you're going to get a direct invite, just shuffle every major. So it's a tricky problem. Fans want to see more stable rosters in Dota. It's probably the worst competitive game in terms of the roster shuffling, at least up until now. Maybe the roster locks are going to help with that. Will it make for better Dota? I'm not really sure, but I think instead of seeing kind of constant unscheduled shuffling, you'll just see like these intense blocks of like crazy reshuffling, players just YOLOing, randomly throwing a roster together, hoping for the best, not actually getting to practice with it first. I don't know what the solution is though, because if you want to run these majors 3 majors NTI, you've got the major ends. You have like 2-3 weeks where there's not going to be any events scheduled because teams won't play them because they want their downtime, and they also want to go home see their family. The majors probably going to be similar to DAC, I'm guessing, which is 2.5-3 week commitment, at least 2 weeks. So it's a lot of time away from home. So you've got 2-3 weeks off. That's the better part of 1 month already gone. Then you've got to fit all the other events in, and some of them. That's the weird thing, is how do you run an event in that situation? And so, like, in our case, we're running the Summit. It's planned for the end of this year, though we haven't announced all the details yet. When do we do the qualifiers? We can't do them in November. So then we're doing the qualifiers in October, and maybe the very beginning of November. But half the teams that qualify, if they do shit at the major, they may just disband. And then you're just randomly inviting new teams at some point. So I think it's going to be really messy for third-party tournaments especially, and it may drive some events to just do more direct invites, but to me that's a big problem. If that's how it shakes out, which I'm not sure it is, but if that is how it shakes out, look at this TI. You have 2 wildcard teams who did incredibly well. CDEC, second place, took a game off EG in the grand finals, went undefeated to get there. Biggest evidence that we need more qualifier slots at the international that there's ever been. But then it goes deeper. You've got MVP Phoenix, who ends up finishing top 8, Complexity top 12, and people said NA Dota is shit and won't go anywhere, and then these guys still put on a pretty good run. Even eHome finishes, I think it was top 4. Yeah, they lost to LGD, right?
Top 6, I assume.
Top 6. Okay, so another wildcard team, another team that was not directly invited. So you really want to have more qualifier slots at events and less direct invites, especially for the non-major events, so that these teams have a chance to prove themselves. But the way that the roster lock is going to work and the shuffling, it's almost to the point where like there's only a handful of events that are going to be able to fit into that 2-month window, counting the downtime after the one major and the downtime as the teams get ready for the next, where you can even squeeze the qualifiers in. So, yeah, I mean, I think it's my experience with Valve has generally been they don't necessarily do a perfect job the first time. In fact, they royally screw things up sometimes the first time, or at least could do things a lot better. But I think they are the best in the industry when it comes to iterating, at least in Dota. Like TI4, there were a lot of complaints, a lot of criticism, whether it was the format, the production. They didn't really tell the stories of newbie Vici Gaming. Hell, the pre-show for TI4 had like an hour of Alliance and EG. EG had already been eliminated the day before. They barely touched on newbie Vici Gaming. There was like no video content. That obviously was a lot better this year. And I mean, even just looking at the fact that a lot of teams got eliminated before the main event, you had teams that had newbie who had a pretty poor group stage, to be honest, and then they just go through the bubble race, they win all these matches, suddenly they're in the upper bracket, and people are just like, what was the point of the group stage if you could just claw your way out, as long as you're not the bottom 3 teams. So I think Valve is probably the best company in the industry. Well, if you compare them to any event operator, be it ESL, DreamHack, Blizzard, Riot, at just learning from their mistakes and improving for the next time. So I think it's going to be a bit of a shit show, to be totally honest with you. The rosters are going to be a mess. The whole subsystem, none of the players like it. It's just, it doesn't feel good to them. I know a lot of the big managers have a lot of problems with the subsystem as well. But the good thing with Valve is even if it's a shit show for the first or second major, they're going to get it right eventually. So yeah, I'm not sure this is the ultimate solution, but hey, at least they're trying, which previously there was no structure there. They're trying to put a little order in the world, and I think when it comes to Dota, that can't hurt. We've generally just been operating by pure chaos theory for a while now.
I want to get your perspective on some of the old great teams of yore. Okay, so one I want to start with is an obvious one, which is the early Na'Vi teams, the early ones that were making all these international finals. When people think back, okay, they'll think back quite differently now, maybe a little bit rose-tinted glasses in terms of how good certain players were. I notice a problem in a lot of games with casual fans is the assumption always is when there's like an all-time great team or the team that dominates early, they always think, right, oh, every player was like just the best at his role and they're all just absolutely like they're knocking it out the park. But usually it's something like a couple of players were very key in that particular time, or something about the way they played the meta, or some innovation they brought. That's usually what puts a team ahead, you know. So when you think of the first Na'Vi teams, obviously they were quite drastically different as the lineup changed. What's the core thing about Na'Vi that you think of when you think back to those teams?
TI. Okay, so let's take this one TI at a time. So TI2. The thing that really stands out to me is honestly, more than anything, it's just Dendi. That was a patch where Rubik was incredibly strong. He had higher base movement speed, his Fade Bolt did more damage, and it also had a longer bounce range, acquisition range, so he was a really strong solo mid. And getting level 6 on him early was incredibly powerful. He'd get an early Blink Dagger and could just take over games. And Dendi at that TI, him and Ferrari were the two players who their individual skill literally made the difference in more games than it did not. So I think for that TI, I really look at Dendi's individual play more than anything as the X factor and the thing that made that team special. And I mean, of course, you know, it's Dendi. You see, there's a great clip of him after he won a match where he's doing Gangnam Style dancing as he jumps across the stage after a crazy win. I forget which match it was exactly, but that was when Dendi really went from someone that everyone knew from TI1 into basically cemented his status as a Dota legend, no matter how the rest of his career went. And, well, unfortunately, hasn't been going so well lately. TI3 Na'Vi, to me, I think if there's a player that stands out, it's probably Funnick, who, if you go back before TI3, Funnick was actually played on Empire. And I don't know how closely you followed Navi's history of player acquisitions, but they're basically the Yankees of Dota.
They just take everyone from Virtus Pro, Moscow 5, just take whoever they want, right?
Exactly. Like normally in professional sports, like the pro team has their own farm team. Navi's farm teams are the other CIS teams. They've got Virtus Pro, they've got Empire, Power Rangers, you name it. They've at this point poached players from Hellraisers, another team that I could easily see them poaching players from in the future. They've got the money, they have the brand at this point after winning TI1. And Funnick was the star of Empire. And he was, I think at that time, a lot of people were starting to look at him as like, he was basically the Arteezy of that era. The way people looked at him is like, this is the next big deal. Like, Funnick is going to be like a franchise player to build a team around. And Na'Vi poached him from Empire. And people weren't really sure what to expect. He ended up playing a pretty similar role. This was a guy, Clinks was really strong back then, and he was the Clink specialist. And Darkseer was also a really big hero. I remember one best of 3 where he plays Clinks versus a Darkseer. He wins the matchup, right? Which the Clinks, if he plays well, normally can at least break even, shouldn't die, and can win if he just out CS's and punishes the Darkseer when he skips behind the tower. And then he switches the matchup. He plays the Darkseer side of the matchup, and he crushes the enemy Clinks the next game. So TI3, if I had to pick a player, Funnick was probably the biggest difference maker. But I think TI3 Na'Vi was much less about individual performance or even being better than other teams. I mean, frankly, I look at that TI. Orange should have been in the grand finals. It wasn't just the Aegis denied by KYXY. They still could have won that game, but they tilted after it. I mean, who wouldn't? They just denied the Aegis in a lower bracket finals. You're championship Sunday, you're almost there. KYXY, please. But they tilted. I still think they were actually overall the better team. And like if you play that series 10 times, I think Orange wins more times than Na'Vi does. But Na'Vi just had the magic about them. That was the Na'Vi to me, where it's like these guys are just clutch. They just find a way to win. Where it frankly doesn't make sense. Like mathematically, they're in a terrible position. They don't have good late game. They don't have map control. Like they're the team that's on a clock and they're behind, and somehow they would pull shit out of nowhere.
Well, that was where in other games, I remember in League, all up the front page, we got all these highlight videos of all the podge hooks, and people obviously in League were like, what the fuck, you can do like a thresh hook back to, and they were like, that's so broken, what a rubbish game, and you were like, no, you have to realise, like, they're fucked if they miss those, like, that's not like just something you spam and it's fine, like, you do this, and they're going to be out in the tournament if you just land all that shit.
Yeah, I mean, you look at that Fountain Hook match, and I was actually watching in the players' lounge at the time. This was in Benaroya Hall, so it was a much more like intimate stadium. Pretty much everyone who was working the event who wasn't actively playing or casting would hang out in the lounge unless they were getting ready to play the next match, and Valve puts them in different rooms. And I'm watching there, and the players were just going nuts. They were all so upset. They're like, this isn't Dota. I distinctly remember Loda like beside himself trying to talk to like any Valve employee could find. Like, this is
classic.
This isn't Dota. You know, like this. What is this? This is not part of the game. A team should not be able to win a match this way. And you know, it was Western players in a lot of cases going against Na'Vi essentially. Not necessarily. You know, and who knows why? Maybe they were afraid of Na'Vi. I think a lot of it was they were just like this. Tong Fu is playing better here. They should win this game. And it's kind of like that. They've earned this win, but what Valve has always been very consistent about is if it's in the game and it's not an exploit. If it's an exploit, they patch it out. If it's not an exploit, they leave it in the game. So the Fountain Hooks had already been shown before. That's the thing that people forget is it wasn't the first time that a Fountain Hook had happened. Na'Vi had actually. This was back when there was a lot of meaningless online tournaments to teams like Na'Vi because back then the prize pools were just tiny compared to TI. Now at least you see some 6-digit prize pools, which are quite healthy by any standard, and certainly compared to back then. So Na'Vi would just fuck around in a lot of their online matches, and I cast a couple of the games where they just practice Fountain Hooks all day. They wouldn't even try to win. They ended up losing, but the funny thing about that much was that's actually the only way they could have won the game. If they Fountain Hooked anyone except for the gyrocopter, because Hal had the Aegis at the time, they still lose because they just get a kill, and then that hero is just going to come back and they'll go again. But they lost the gyro twice because he got Fountain Hooked, so he respawns in their fountain and he dies again. It was. I mean, you can't even write the script for that. That is just 1,000,001 shot. That team was just not afraid. It got to the point where the Chinese teams would start banning Pudge against them, and. That to me is like a far more ridiculous scenario. Like you look at the grand finals of TI5, CDEC bans Techies a bunch, and ultimately, you know, Techies is kind of gimmicky in a way. A lot of people look at Pudge like, oh, that's not a real hero. That's kind of a clown strat. But I mean, Pudge is far riskier than Techies is now. Like back then, that was an extremely risky pick. He has terrible laning. He doesn't scale that well with farm, and he's not generally a very good team fight hero, but Na'Vi they just found a way. That team just had something magical about them, and then of course the run ended in the grand finals. Their luck finally ran out. I'm sure that one still haunts Puppy. The game 1 draft was just very, very off. They ended up picking like basically a 3 support tri lane. It did not work out. They still almost went on to win game 5, and I remember I had dinner with a Dendi after it, and I mean it was even the day after, and he was still fuming. I mean, they did not agree on what to do as far as how to close out that game when they had a big lead. And hey, I mean that definitely hurt. So I don't know. I think that Na'Vi at TI3 just had magic. Na'Vi at TI2 was the Dendi show. I think that's pretty much how I look back at them.
So when I mentioned this team, okay, don't get too excited. Just build into it, okay. Don't go. So team, I need you to explain this team to me because. This is a team where I actually think Dota 2 in some way lacks some of the aspects of esports journalism, you know. They have people doing stuff and they have people who are really into it, you know, but there's not really as much historical stuff, which is my shit, you know. I just love that. So I'm always interested to read that stuff myself in when other people write it, and it's just when people don't write it, sometimes I'm like, oh, I guess I'll have to do the research and write that article. I've never heard a really good explanation for how the fuck that DK team were just gods, just unreal, and then just nothing when it came to that Tian, just off a cliff. How is that possible? How were they that good? What were they so good at? And then what is your theory for what happened? How can you explain that?
So I'm trying to remember back. If I recall correctly, when DK first formed, it was shortly after TI3, and the meta at the time. Generally, the way the lanes would shake out is you would have a 1v1 for one of the side lanes. Normally, an off like the 2 offlaners basically match up against each other. A strong safe lane carry versus an offlaner. and you would generally have a 1v1 mid. There weren't many dual lanes in the off lane. Teams were not abandoning it shortly after TI3. And where DK really excelled was dominating 1v1 matchups because they had Mushi and they had Ice Ice Ice. And they were gods of 1v1. They actually, I think it was the TI3 tournament, 1v1 tournament, where they played each other in the grand finals. Oh, that's right. They played in the grand finals of the 1v1 tournament, and Ice 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 was playing Mushi, and it was a mirror match. They're both Timbersaw, and for those who don't know, Timbersaw does almost all pure damage. Aside from one of his nukes, if he doesn't hit a tree, it's magic damage. So Mushi bought a cloak, which clearly shows he doesn't play much Timbersaw because pure damage, it ignores magic resistance, essentially. So it was a crazy 1v1, but they just dominated everyone to get to the finals. And yeah, players generally don't take 1v1s that seriously, especially at an event like TI. There's no real prize money in it for them. But this team had arguably the two best 1v1 players in the world on one team, and the meta was that you could just you get the matchups. And so they would always pick heroes and lane in a way where they would get those two 1v1s, dominate the solo matchups. Your tri-lane's still incredibly solid. I mean, you've got Lana burning. It's still going to be a strong lane anyway, and it allowed them to do so much with the drafts where other teams would have to start playing to counter DK instead of play their own style. So suddenly they're trying to dual lane because Ice 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 is getting out of control, or they're looking to gank Mushi and then Burning gets more space. So I think that meta really favored them the way their roster was built with incredible individual skill. They had kind of an interesting hybrid of styles, and that to me is that SEA Chinese fusion where you had kind of the more stable, solid play of a Burning, of a Lanham, of a MMY, and then you also have like the slightly more balls to the wall, a little bit suicidal at times, Ice Ice Ice, and you've got Mushi who wants to go for the big plays and is a little bit more of a gambler, and they just kind of balanced each other out. I think where that team ultimately struggled a bit, from talking to some people who are friends with the players, now we're looking back over a year, that they did have a little bit of an ego problem. Mushi has always been captain for pretty much every team as long as I can remember that he's been on, and Burning also has been a captain or generally the guy on every team he's been on. And I'm not sure that they necessarily had overly big egos, but I think it made it tough for them at TI when things started to struggle to figure out who was going to get the space, who was going to get the farm priority. And the other big thing that I think hurt them was they just had the target on their back. They had Secret Syndrome, I think even more than Secret did, because this was a team that everyone watched, and everyone was like, this is crazy. The Western, DK was probably as much a Western fan favorite as they were an Eastern one. Very unique, because Ice Ice Ice, Mushi, and Burning are just such iconic players. I think you look at Secret, and they don't really have quite that same crossover with the Chinese fans. And yeah, part of that's definitely that your average Chinese fan is extremely nationalistic. That's just a fact. But I think part of it was that DK just felt like more of, what was the team that that Element was on? Was it NOA? Was it the
CS team? Yeah,
the CS team.
You mean the NOA, where they had like a couple of Europeans? It was Norwegian players, and they had a Canadian and a United States player. And the idea was it was like a really weird mixture of players, you know.
I mean, DK was like a slightly lesser version of that, I guess, because they were, well, not lesser, but kind of in the similar vein, where they had these players from different regions, not quite as disparate as that NOA team, but I think that's where they just kind of brought in fans from all over. And, I mean, DK just had swagger. This was a team that they played WPCA, so still haven't paid out the prize money, so they're bastards, but gave us probably the best series in the history of Dota for me as far as the overall arc of the match. They were playing IG. They go down 0-3, and this is a best of 7 in Dota, which is actually incredibly stupid. Best of 7s are way too long. It's like, if it goes the distance, the games are reasonably long and you have some breaks. It's like a 9-10 hour commitment. It's like trying to marathon all the Star Wars movies in one day. Sure, some people will do it, but it's generally not for the average viewer. I think there was like a 2-hour break in the middle because one of the players had to go back to the Vici office because they were traveling off to an international event shortly thereafter. I stayed up on New Year's Eve to cast the damn thing. You know, the Chinese celebrate their own New Year's, so it wasn't a holiday for them. We're here in the U.S., and so I was going a little bonkers. TK reverse all kills them. Who does that? They come back 4-3. Not in StarCraft where you can just cheese a couple maps and catch someone off guard and suddenly you've got 2 points. But they grind it out 4 games in a row over the course of like 5 hours to win the series. So I think that team kind of evoked like the same sentiment Navi did, where they just captured like the hearts and minds of fans. And as to why they fell apart, I think combination of just too many cooks, and I think more importantly, the meta kind of shifted in a way that didn't favor them as much, where it was much less about the individual matchups and much more about the team play and having a clear commander and idea of how to play the game, which is where Newbie and Vici did incredibly well, because you've RTK and Xiao much more like of a dictator style of captain and a very strong leader on each of those teams, and everyone just giving them the space and letting them be the leader. On DK, it's always the downside with these all-star teams is anyone going to listen to one guy? Is there going to be the one guy? Or are you going to have a secret situation where, everyone has their own ideas and players have egos and are fighting with each other? And I mean, we saw the aftermath when the players went public about that. But it definitely hurts DK that and it's now, Alliance, I guess, is the only team where they went into an international as, like, outrageous favorites. Nobody had Alliance outside of the top 3, and most people had them finishing first or second, where they actually delivered and won the event. I'm not sure if there's been another team that favored at a TI who did that well and met expectations.
So obviously, one of the teams that a direct parallel as an analog we can draw between this is Secret, because they share a similar kind of historical story in this sense, like the best in the world at one point in time, racking up wins after wins after wins, and the all-star factor, like it's so many good players. So when they're winning, it all makes sense. Like, yeah, they've got all the good players and it's all working great, obviously, but both disappointing TIs respective to where they were. Now in the case of Secret though, there's the weirder element where, at least in DK's aspect, they were super dominant early, and then there was at least a couple of events where like IG was getting wins, etc. So they were still like top 2, top 3, but it's not like they fell off completely. It's Secret, it's more confusing because they were just, all the events they won were right before TI. Aside from just stuff like ego, etc., do you think they were in any way figured out? Were they exposed at TI? Like for example, if we just play TI over 10 times, do you think this was just the one really bad one where it was like things spiraled, people were arguing, and then they just got the worst possible result? Are there a bunch of them, if we replay it over, where actually they do just go on and win, or they do come into the final? Do you think in any way, in terms of the metagame, they were figured out, or people got a good grasp on them?
I think so, a little bit. They had their comfort here. It was like a perfect example. I think even a better example of like where Secret was very predictable, and actually the very LGD-esque, back when LGD, the old LGD, which, well, Xiao, even at this TI, was fairly consistent, but they picked almost the same heroes every game at DAC, and I think they finished first in the group stage there, and then ended up finishing, what was it, 3rd place, I want to say? Yeah, 3rd place. Where it's like every game, it's Shadow Fiend, it's Queen of Pain, they're running the jungle Chen, they get the mech, they go for a big timing push and just overrun their opponents in the mid game, and it just felt so cookie cutter for them at DAC, and they did get figured out of that tournament. EG and Vici Gaming, I still think Secret was the best team at that event. Vici Gaming very close behind them, and PPD's even said he doesn't think EG was as good as the other teams there. He just thinks that they figured them out and were able to counter them, and I think that's an example of where Secret ultimately got a little too comfortable. And it's interesting because Puppy's historically known for being a very unorthodox drafter. I mean, you look at TI2 where he picks oh god, what was it? And he picked I'm trying to remember now. It was the game that they ended up losing. God, my brain is farting. He picked something that was before its time at TI2, and the last match they played at the event where they ended up getting eliminated. And it was funny because the hero later, now it's killing me that I can't remember this, but the hero later got patched so that what he had in mind as a counter actually would have worked. But at the time, it was before its time. So, I mean, Puppy historically, very innovative captain. You look at the Pudge picks that he would always go for, and like he's got balls as a captain. That was always the story with Puppy in a way that, that was kind of the reason why some of the Western fans didn't like the captains like Xiao Wei, because they just pick what works. And yeah, it's very predictable. You know what's coming your way. But Secret did feel a lot more predictable at this TI. I feel like they didn't have that totally off the wall, out of nowhere new style that I would have expected, to be honest. I mean, S4 as a captain and a drafter, a little bit more in that Xiao 8 mold, historically very, TI3, that was probably the team that picked the most. Like you literally know what they're going to do every game, and you still can't really stop it. So I could kind of see where maybe that's a bit of the S4 influence, but I did feel like they were a little predictable. They got figured out, and I think it's generally an issue for a lot of teams. Like you look at CDEC and the run they had at TI. I'm not sure if they'll have the same success. I love the team. I ended up getting assigned like 4 or 5 CDEC matches in the group stage, at least three to 5, a bunch basically. And I had cast CDEC in online tournaments, and frankly, they were not impressive. A lot of people look back like, oh well, they went close with LGD in this online cup, or they took a game off of IG, or they beat IG here. First of all, IG looked terrible going into TI. And I don't think anyone who was following the scene expected them to do well, especially knowing Chuan's history when he's on a struggling team, where he generally keeping his morale up and staying focused can be a big issue. But I don't think anyone who really followed the Chinese scene closely expected that out of CDEC. But part of it was the element of surprise. And then you go into the main event, EG was able to solve them, and they found the weak points. And I think with Secret, a lot of it seems to be a recurring trend in Dota. It's the teams that come in really strong, they are going to have the bullseye. And so I'm really curious about this upcoming TI. Let's just assume that EG stays together. They keep their 5-man roster. They look, by all accounts, like they should be the most dominant team, or if not, definitely top 3 dominant teams over the next year. Let's say they go in with a consistent style. PPD is going to be an interesting position where, I think for the first time ever, we might actually see someone who has to adjust if he wants to go deep, because as talented as the team is, as great a captain as he is, if they just go in and run the same style, I think they may end up falling the same way that a DK and LGD historically and Secret at this TI did it. It's interesting. I think a lot of teams may look back on some of these recent results and start feeling like they need more of those pocket strats. This is also where coaches really come in. There's been a big rise in coaches have proliferated a lot in the Western scene, especially. The Chinese scene is at 71 for years now as the coach and kind of the pinnacle of what a coach can bring to a team, from a team morale to strategy to being able to kind of coax the players into thinking differently about the game. But now almost every team has a coach, and a lot of the players want the coaches to be able to be involved in the drafts. A lot of the Western players, especially. DAC actually tried to do it, and the Western managers just flipped their shit because some of them didn't have coaches, so it's just disadvantageous at that point. But I think that's where coaches being in the game may allow these teams to be a little more creative because they have that extra resource. But yeah, I think it has been a historical trend. The teams that have a bullseye generally get figured out, and no matter how good they are, struggle to go the distance at the next big event they attend.
So if we talk about Evil Geniuses, the winners of TI, when I did my interview with AUI, he was essentially in different forms trying to tell me that like Evil Geniuses just has the best player at every position, and you couldn't get better. But even if someone explicitly told you make an all-star team, they are not supposed to be a real team, he'd still just be like, it has to be all the guys in EG. They're just so good. I can understand why a player might think that way. I mean, obviously they have different ways of thinking of the game in terms of to them, someone who plays off them might seem like a better player than someone who skill-wise is better, but they wouldn't have the same synergy. So in that sense, okay, I can understand why EG is so highly touted role by role, because they do seem to fit together very, very well and maybe cover certain weaknesses, enhance, facilitate other strengths. But when you actually look at EG going into this tournament, you kind of touched on it here. Even though they won the tournament and were so comprehensive in general, aside from that one CDEC series, I don't really look at this team and go, yeah, this is an all-star team. I don't look at it like a secret team and go, oh, they're just secret, but also with the best strategy, How do you actually see the Evil Geniuses team here? Because obviously the win they had at DAC was just out of nowhere at the very beginning of the lineup, and then they didn't really have that much full-on success until this TI. So now that lineup's not going to exist anymore, AUI is gone, how should we think back on that team? What was the core values or core qualities that you think really stood out?
It's a lot of people, a lot of commentators and, well, mainly analysts, a lot of people who follow the Dota scene closely have said this for a long time, and I think this TI proves it almost completely, is that PPD as a captain and that team in particular, I will preface this by saying a lot of people have, said as of late, like, oh, PPD's the best drafter. And he's actually got mad about that and said, it's not just me drafting. The whole team is input. Yeah, when we're actually in the booth, I may be the one making the picks, but we've all discussed the strategy. We work on the game plan together, and everyone gives input. Sure. Fear's been around for ages and has a lot of say in the team universe. Normally a bit quieter, but they all give input. But that said, I think that team as a whole and PPD as a leader, they adapted. They're just the best at adapting over the course of an event. A lot of the teams at TI really did not adapt. CDEC did not adapt at all. And granted, it was only one BO5, so they didn't have a day to kind of go back and rethink things, which kind of sucks when you come in the winner's bracket and they get to see your style, and when they get back, you have to have something else ready or just hope that you can adapt in the middle of the draft and the series. But PPD and that EG team they're just the best at adapting and figuring out the weaknesses of other team style. I mean, individual skill side, and obviously all of them are great individual players, but I don't think individual talent was their strength. Like, I compare that team to Secret or DK, and purely in terms of individual talent, at least as a spectator and as a fan, you look at those as the flashier, more all-star lineups, DK at TI4, Secret at TI5, maybe a little bit more ceiling on the individual level. I'm sure there are pros watching this right now are like, oh, he's full of shit, but that's just, what the casual viewer thinks, and, myself as a commentator, it's just certain players are more hyped, basically, sure, and viewed as more individual talents. But where EG proved that Dota is not just about individual skill is they just figured teams out, whether it was through the draft, whether it was through pressuring a certain player. The big story of that grand finals, obviously, was that Shiki just couldn't match up against Sumail 1v1, and part of it was that sometimes he didn't always get the best matchups, but that's because EG figured out how to draft to punish CDEC, and he just couldn't really play Leshrac on the level that EG could. It wasn't here he practiced or was that comfortable with. So I think what people will probably remember most about EG, aside from USA, is just how damn good the team is at adapting. This EG is a little different. Arteezy, by most accounts, and I mean, I can't really argue with it, is basically the LeBron James of Dota 2, minus the raids. This is like LeBron James before he gets the raids. Yeah. Where if he's on the market, you almost can't not sign him, no matter how good your lineup is, even if you want a championship. So that part I do understand where AUI is coming from, and I mean, hey, he's pretty mature compared to most Dota players to be able to take the ego out of it and say, I can't really fault them on like a purely professional level. It's never a bad move to sign Arteezy on paper. I think this EG team with Arteezy now, you've Sumail and Arteezy, just mechanically, these are two of the most gifted, if not the two most gifted and accomplished players in the game. I mean, Sumail very young, of course, but has proven it time and again. And if you just watch their streams and you compare it to other pro streams, even if you're a casual viewer, you can kind of see the difference, where they're just that, like Sumail, I watched one of his pubs yesterday, just the way he moves through the jungle and how efficient every single step of his rotations is, and his ability to just, you'll see him, it's always fun to watch player perspective. It's one of the things that I think Dota has over big time over League is, first of all, the replay system, and then the fact that you can literally see where their mouse is and basically figure out what they're thinking and focusing and worrying about. And you can just see, he's trying to bait this guy. He is just so confident he will outreact as a storm and dodge an incoming stun or potential nuke that he'll go for the big play. So I think this new EG is a much more of that all-star kind of lineup than the old one. But yeah, that old one to me was very solid, well-rounded team. Definitely no slouches in terms of talent, but their biggest strength was not individual talent. It was definitely their ability to adapt and to draft and to just figure out their opponents.
So a team who did not do well at TI and hasn't particularly done well this year, IG. I need to ask you about this team, okay? Because I'll be entirely forthright. My favorite player all the time I've watched Dota 2 has been Ferrari. And what I love about him as a player is, aside from the fact that obviously he was very, very good at one point in time, he's in general so consistent. And so he's one of those players where you can enjoy watching him to a degree, even if his team's losing or the lineup isn't the strongest it's ever been, But during the last year or so of that team, it has kind of felt like he was in prison, basically. He was still good, still had sometimes he was really good, but you just knew looking at the team, and especially as events went by, they're just not going to be the best team. And it's almost impossible, even some of the losses they would have wouldn't even be that entertaining the way they'd lose. And then, partway through this, they just okay, well, it's okay, we've got Burning now. Now listen, I know you're someone who has a certain predilection for burning anti-mages and whatnot. Okay, so I'm sure you yourself were kind of like, okay, maybe this is it. Maybe this is like the movie where the two old dogs are like, listen, together, we'll join. It's like the anime but they've seen, we'll join forces and we can beat the boss.
It would make Eternal Envy really happy.
Okay, story. Yeah. So you think, okay, this is what we need to do. Yeah. And it almost didn't seem to change a whole lot. It's the same sort of like, oh, really? They're still losing. Oh, they can't get it. Do you think anything different could have been done about IG? Are they just in a bad place roster-wise? Why don't they get better players? Are they within the Chinese scene? Do you think they're too low down in the hierarchy or something? They can't get the free agents? What do you think it is about IG? Because these players, we still see the flashes in these particular players of brilliance, but they haven't got anything close to those elite-level Chinese teams, it seems.
To me, IG was one of the biggest groups of individuals at TI, and it's interesting because historically, the Western perspective is all Chinese teams are just these, automatons who just like always blindly will follow the leader and just have one 5-man, death ball strategy. TI4 reinforced that stereotype, unfortunately, for a lot of more casual fans. IG is actually, their problem was they weren't a team. That's basically how I felt watching this team. Like, whenever they would win, it would never be a great overall strategy, an outdraft, or like a really strong general team performance. Not to say there wouldn't be games where they all played well, but it always felt like with that team was always an individual performance. Like the Burning Anti-Mage game, perfect example. Like, sure, they kind of figured out we're only going to win this if this Anti-Mage gets completely out of control and Burning we trust, but I don't think they went into the game planning to do that. It was not really a planned strategy. It was just like, oh shit, this is all we could do. And they'd have other games. It wasn't always Burning. Sometimes it would be 430, more like 4 to 6 months before TI. He actually started to look pretty bad around that Red Bull Battlegrounds event. And just in terms of the expectations for 430, it's like Dendi, where this guy was the man at TI2. Him and Dendi, they were the two solo mids that were these solo mids. This was before Mushi really had burst onto the scene. TI3, I think, was where Mushi really made his mark and established himself as a truly dominant and elite solo mid player who could also take his team the next level. And by that measure, 430 was just a huge disappointment. So I feel like 430 wasn't on his A game, and it's really hard to say why. I haven't gone back and watched player perspective. I doubt it's like his individual mechanics or ability just being weak. I mean, maybe he's gotten lazy and isn't practicing, but I think it was more so just this was not a team with any clear identity or leadership, and they would. That series where they end up taking the game off Secret it just felt like it's like, okay, let's just pick all of our iconic heroes and then we're just going to hope for the best. Like, just pick Burning Anti-Mage, hope for the best. Pick Chuan Rubik or Sandcake, just hope for the best, even if it isn't necessarily the best pick. So I think that team, more than any other, suffered from a real lack of leadership and also just of camaraderie. I don't know if the players were close. Like, when we had them here at the Summit, Vici Gaming is a great example of a team where, like, those guys... we have a couch area where it's like there's some fun games. You have like Gang Beasts and Smash Brothers. Just players can whine when they're at the Summit and they're not playing their matches if they won, and the fans can watch and laugh along with them. Vici Gaming would always be there, like all 7 of them, and the Chinese players in general. It's kind of a cultural thing. They're a little more physically affectionate. Like they'll kind of like rest their head on each other and they'll put their arms around each other, and it's just they're comfortable and. They're not homophobic about it, but you never saw that with IG. IG, they were very much like, we're kind of here for business. When the match is over, we're all going to go our separate ways. Maybe we'll talk. They weren't enemies, but you just didn't feel like they were all united. And it's interesting because a lot of the interviews that Valve did really captured this. With RTK, there was the CDEC profile as well, where and Xiao Waits, where like the biggest word that they used was unity. That the teams that like unified behind a leader, an idea about how to play the game, an overall strategy, or just like a mentality, like those were the teams that did the best. You saw with EG, you saw with CDEC, you saw with LGD, and IG to me, like they probably had the worst unity out of almost any of the teams. Maybe not out of any, but definitely like bottom 10-20% in terms of unity. And the fact that they even went as far as they did to me is impressive because. Well, I mean, the individual skill, maybe some of their players are falling off. I have been a Burning fan for a long time, and yeah, there's all like you identify. There's that little special Sunday when he's playing an iconic hero like Anti-Mage. The guy's a living legend, but he's definitely fallen off a bit. I don't necessarily think it's an individual play. I think it's very similar to Dendi, where they need a change of scenery, and they need it just incredibly bad. I see those players needing to be with new blood. If you look at most successful teams in Dota, they have this interesting mixture nowadays of like some veteran leadership, individual talent, obviously, and then like the young, like kind of hot-headed, like Sumails, or whether it's even Aggressive, who had not done a whole lot coming into TI. Maybe comes to mind for LGD. You've got like the backbone of Xiao Wade and Yao, and these veteran support and utility players, and then like the hot-headed young cores who bring that like passion and kind of extra energy. I feel like IG was lacking fire, and I think maybe it's just the fact that they've all been playing for so damn long. They all have very settled ways about how to look at the game, and they're not really being challenged the way that like PPD is by Sumail and the way he thinks about the game, or the way he was by Arteezy a couple years back. So I think those players, honestly, they just need to play with new blood, and I think we could see a lot of them still being very successful in the future if they do that.
So you referenced maybe there, another obviously great mid player there. When everyone was talking about LGD as they went through this run at TI, obviously the storyline, the overarching narrative is all going to be about Xiao Wei and can he repeat, etc. What do you think of the emergence of maybe in this sense? Because it felt like if they'd have made the final, he might have been like an MVP candidate for the whole tournament,
Everybody knew what he was capable of. I think for those who even slightly followed the Chinese scene, so he's an example of a player who, like, fans who would watch CDEC, they would, and a part of it's the way the commentators kind of paint the picture of that CDEC team. If you, how long ago was it when he left for LGD? Maybe 4 or 6 months ago, something like that.
Long ago.
Yeah, where it was like the way that we would talk about this team was very much it's maybe +4, and that was the way the team strategically played. Like they would give him these high priority farm heroes, they'd create space for him. Basically, it's kind of like the way some burning teams have gone historically, where it's like all your eggs in the burning basket, and it was all your eggs in the maybe basket for that team. So when he leaves CDEC, the natural assumption is like, well, they lost their best player. Like, he is the team. How can they possibly go anywhere after that? And so I think a lot of people expected he had the potential to be a great player, but my God, did he deliver it to you. I don't know if there's been a better individual Ember Spirit performance than the first game he had versus Cloud9, where LGD, by all rights, should have lost that game. If you start the game at like, what was it, 45 minutes or whatever, it was pretty one-sided, and just simulate it 100 times, I think Cloud9, if they don't do Cloud9 things, win that game like 95 to 98 times out of 100. And I'm sure they would say the same thing about how the game turned out. But sure, they were giving one opening. Cloud9 dove the fountain, gave up like 3 or 4 kills, but maybe just he played the perfect Ember Spirit game. He pitched a shutout. It was, I don't know if I've ever seen a better Ember Spirit performance, and I think he really made his mark for himself. I think this TI was really cool because it was the first TI in a while where there were a lot of young, like just new blood players, either relatively young players or just new to like the international scene of the TI. Because a lot of the CDEC players are actually not young; they're 24, 25, and they've been playing on some level for a long time, but they just haven't been on these premier teams. But there were just so many great individual young players who stepped up, whether it's Maybe or Sumail. Aggressive comes to mind as someone who played exceptionally well. Q as a captain for CDEC, great story there. QO was just godly for MVP Phoenix in a few of his games and really carried them. So I think if you're like a fan of Chinese Dota, the future kind of looks bright in that sense. I think I've gotten sidetracked from your original question, but yeah, maybe to me he was just a sight to behold at the event. I'm kind of sad that he didn't go all the way, but I'm looking forward to seeing more of him in the future. And to me, he probably after FY, it's like Aggressive and Maybe especially as far as like the young core players go, as the 3 most in demand in China. Well, FY is support, but the 3 most in demand players in the Chinese scene for sure.
So another great TI storyline was the run of Vici Gaming through the lower bracket, and obviously the year before, TI4, again, Vici had this super sick run like that, but they were very different teams. I mean, you can't really say that they're the same team when one has How and Ice 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 and the other one's quite a different lineup. What do you think, what were the runs aside from just literally going through the roll bracket? Were there any similarities? What were the differences between the 2 different Vici Gaming teams to you?
Oh, God. So Vici Gaming, going into TI4, if I recall, Vici Gaming were definitely not, they were not viewed as a favorite by any means. They were viewed as like a solid kind of middle of the road team. This was when, people weren't really sure about RTK, because the old DK was Burning and RTK as probably the 2 biggest names and fan favorites, and they were like their brothers. When they split, it was just a huge like sad moment for a lot of fans of the team. And they were very publicly and openly sad about it, especially RTK is pretty open with his emotions in general as a player. And he was viewed as a little washed up, to be honest. RTK was not viewed as a top-tier off-laner. Ice was a massive upgrade in most fans' eyes. And in terms of individual play, he was. I mean, he was just doing things as an individual that RTK was not at the time. And that's never really been RTK's biggest strength, his individual play in the early lanes especially. He's always been much more that explosive, just in the right place at the right time, makes the clutch play kind of off-laner. Ice, just the total opposite end of the spectrum. Not to say he's not also clutch at moments, but more flashy and more, kind of Sumail-esque, but just in the off lane. But yeah, looking at that Vici gaming team, I don't think many people had hugely high hopes. I think maybe some people put them like top 6 or 8, but the way they ended up finishing was, to me, again, another example of what we saw with CDEC and LGD and EG at this TI, which is just a very unified team with a clear idea of how to play the game, and they just stuck to it. And they actually stuck to it to a fault. The interesting thing in that grand finals was the games were objectively terrible as far as entertainment value goes. They're all 15, 20 minutes. There's a running meme in the Dota community for those who are less familiar with the game of, better than TI Grand Finals. And pretty much any match that isn't shit is better than TI4 Grand Finals. But
it's the better than Twilight Love Story meme.
Yeah. that Grand Finals was like, it was the unstoppable force versus the immovable object, because Xiao8 and RTK are definitely two of like top 5 most stubborn captains in the world. If they think, like, if they lose a game, most of the time they're not going to blame it on the draft. Yeah, once in a while they get out drafted, but they really, like, they come up with their draft and they just believe in it. And RTK going into that grand finals, he'd had a lot of success with the Sylar Nature's Prophet, and in the grand finals he kept on picking it, and it just did not work against what Newbie was doing with their constant 5-man aggression and just ganking and pressuring early, never giving Sylar these easy pickoffs around the map, never letting him come online. And ultimately that stubbornness proved to be RTK's downfall and Xiao8's greatest triumph. But yeah, that Vici gaming to me was much more of a team that was not expected to do a whole lot, and maybe because the expectations were lower, that's where they were able to make a big run. This Vici gaming had the opposite situation with massive expectations, top 3 the entire year. First half of the year, they win the Summit 2, they won ESO 1 New York, they won, I think, 2 other Chinese events. They placed well at every event they competed in. They were viewed as the best team in the world. And even if you were a bit more biased towards the Western teams, then they're right there after EG and maybe Secret as well, depending on the time of the year. But going into TI, they had a really poor run. They did not do well at the Summit 3. They didn't do well at ESO 1 Frankfurt. They didn't do well at MDL, which was the big Chinese 6-figure prize pool tournament. And DAC, they did well, but they ended up booting Black. They did not win the event, and it looked like they were in position to do it, but EG figured them out. So they had underperformed because the expectations were so high, but they still come into the event as like, this is definitely a top 8 team. They almost didn't make it. That team had issues. It just felt like they were arguing, they weren't on the same page, the players didn't have the same idea about how they wanted to approach the game, and I mean, credit to FY. Maybe not the youngest captain in Dota 2, but if not the youngest, then definitely the most successful young captain in terms of how long he's been playing competitive Dota. So for FY, the guy really pulled his team together. It seemed like as an outsider, and I know one of the issues with that team actually is that Hao he's a very strong personality as a carry, and after the success Newbie had, obvious, and Tong Fu did very well at TI3 as well when Hao was on that team, and still ended up finishing top 4, I believe it was. That team developed an unexpected clash of ideas problem when they picked up Hao, and I think it ultimately was what almost cost them a top 8 finish, was the fact that Hao, very strong personality, has the credentials of having won a TI with Xiao8 and with Newbie, comes in as the big free agent acquisition, and a lot of the other Vici gaming players are kind of reserved. Like Fenrir is very quiet, pretty shy, Super extremely quiet, generally not going to be the guy calling the shots. And even FY as a captain, I wouldn't necessarily say he's quiet, but he's not like super boastful or a commander the way Xiao8 is. I mean, he's a younger player, right? It'll probably come with time. Maybe in a couple years he'll be the big boss and the director style of team leader. But yeah, looking at that team, I think what almost was their total undoing was just how having such a strong personality and just basically undermining FY's leadership is what I heard about the team and a lot of the issues they were having. But I think ultimately it seemed like they're just like, okay, FY, you pick, or you just pick what is going to work, and we're just going to run with it. And they went back to some old school picks. Like they were picking like some out of the meta carry almost every match, whether it was Spectre or Luna. And the cool thing was like they were actually one of the most creative teams in terms of drafting at the event. It's just unfortunate they were in the lower bracket from the get-go, so it makes it very hard to go all the way. But yeah, I think that Vici Gaming team, like they ended up about where they should have, based on how they look coming in. But if you look at their whole arc over the year, I mean, it's the thing with Dota, you know, you can be good 11 months out of the year, but if you're not good at TI, you don't have nearly as much to show for it. It's a pretty crazy game compared to traditional sports or even other esports in that sense.
When you were talking about maybe, that's how I kind of used to characterize his team, CDEC, before, was it really was like, well, I mean, it was literally created to be like the farm team that maybe can be on, and then, you know, we'll see what happens then. So when he left, it's obvious the expectation shouldn't be that they have any chance. They've lost the superstar player, you know. So bearing in mind, this will sound bizarre to phrase it like this, because this was a team that literally could have won the whole fucking tournament. Like, for real, they could have been the TI champions right now, and I'd probably still say this. It feels like there was kind of like a miracle aspect to that whole tournament. So what I want to ask you is, I want to put you to the test here. You can't just be one of those commentators who's like, yeah, every team's good and, you know, they all have really good chances. It wouldn't surprise me if such and such happens. So I'm going to put it like this, okay? Gun to your head. The next 3 majors that are coming up, okay? Will CDEC place top 3 at like 2 of these majors, or will they have really strong? There's only 3, remember, to pick from. So gun to your head. If they don't, we just blow your fucking brains out now, you know, and that's it. Dear. It's just over for you. So what would you really go now if it's like your life's on the line? You gotta give me a real. Hey, if you really think so,
life's on the line.
If you think so, it's a pretty bold statement. So you gotta tell me.
Oh God, this is. Okay, first of all, this is grossly unfair because I have no idea what the next patch is.
Obviously,
look like.
sure.
Nor do I know all the rosters.
Okay, well, there's the disclaimer. Okay.
I think the team was a bit of lightning in the bottle, to be totally honest. I think if you run that TI 20 times, I don't think they have the run they did the majority of the time. I think they end up. I still think they finished top 8 for sure. I think more often than not they're top 6, maybe top 4, but top 2. I think part of that is definitely just getting lucky in terms of like teams being worried about other opponents, not really being in the crosshairs, and then all of it, and also just having a style that really fit the patch especially well. But the way that I actually think I think that team is getting a little too much criticism and a little too much. Oh, this team was just lightning in a bottle and they're not really good at all, and most of the time they wouldn't even be top 8. That's bullshit. I cast that team for the group stage, and they had incredibly clever pocket picks in a lot of their group stage matches. They got a little bit predictable in the grand finals, but that was not because they were predictable in the draft. It was because EG just had them cornered with the fact that Cheeky didn't play Leshrac well, and EG had to ban Naga and Techies every game against them. So I think that game made them look kind of predictable and figured out. But I don't think they were generally a very cookie-cutter team. They ran a Broodmother mid for XC in the grand finals. That was a pocket pick that did a lot of work for them. They were the team that pioneered the Lina picks, and they really created the meta of the tournament. I actually was fortunate enough to basically see its genesis because I happened to cast CDEC very early in the group stage, and not many people were watching. Everyone's watching Secret and EG, and even the Chinese fans. They're watching LGD, they're watching Vici. They don't care about CDEC at that point. They're not expected to go anywhere. They're just a wildcard team. Even eHome had a lot more attention. But they pioneered the style of play where the safe lane carry, aggressive, and true to his name, was aggressive as hell all game long. As soon as he hits 6, he always rotates. Yeah, he would buy his own smoke. He'd go with the supports. He'd TP to the off lane and immediately gank. Like, that was literally the style that every other team began to use, especially the other Chinese teams, as the event ran along. And so they created a meta, and the fact that they did that rather than just like copying a meta and doing well, to me that says a lot about Q and his abilities as a leader and someone who can figure out a style that works for the team. I think they were actually very adaptable. You just didn't see it in the grand finals because there was just too much against them with the way the drafts unfolded, like I mentioned earlier. So I think that team may. I don't think they'll win. I don't think they'll be top 3 the next major. Do I have to? Will they be top 3 at one of the next 3 majors? You know what?
Just what's the sense for it? You know, obviously you're not really going to get your brains blown out.
Yeah, of course. I think they will. I don't think they'll be top 3 at the next major, though, and I think they may end up having to make a roster change. Shiki does seem a bit like the weak link, and, you know, it makes sense. They lost Maybe. They had to find a replacement. That's not to say that Shiki can't improve, though, but at his current level, to me, like, he's ultimately probably the one who gets the axe if they don't perform quite as well as they're hoping. But I think if they can find a player who's a bit more of a playmaker for mid, I see that team being potentially top 3 at the winter as well as the spring major. So yeah, I think they will finish top 3 at one of them. But watch, you'll make me eat crow in 6 months when they're not.
Okay. Do you have any final words to wrap the interview up? A message you want to leave people with?
Oh, jeez. Well, thanks for the interview, Thor. I will just say personally, I really enjoy what you do in CSGO and League. People don't always agree with what you say, but it's nice to have those different opinions. So I hope you'll do more Dota content, guys. If you enjoyed it, make sure to let them know, because obviously this guy has a lot of options as far as games, and I hope you do more Dota content. Just me personally as a fan of your work. Outside of that, shout out to the whole BTS team. You guys are amazing. We've got a lot of cool stuff planned for the upcoming year. And hopefully be able to announce it all over the next couple months. And I think beyond that, no, let's get ready for the fall major, man. It's going to be a blast.